Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 29 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. It's my intention, to the extent possible, for each episode in this series to stand on its own. So my hope is that if you haven't listened to all 28 previous episodes, you will still be able to listen to this one and get something out of it. However, it is still a series. And if you're the kind of person who, like me, likes to have the full context of a story, those previous episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. In the previous 4 episodes, I covered the events of the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. This week, I will return to the Soviet Union and turn the clock back to the early 1980s and begin to set the stage for the dramatic changes that would rock the USSR in the coming decade. This is The End of History, Part 29. Since I started this podcast last year, a lot of people have asked me some version of the same question. Why did you decide to start a history podcast, especially considering how busy you are? The most straightforward answer to that question is because I love history. I've always shared my passion for history with those close to me, as my wife or any member of my family would tell you. So in starting a podcast, in some ways, I'm just expanding my circle to continue doing something I've always done, learning about history and sharing what I learned with others. The reasoning goes deeper than that, though. My unofficial tagline for this podcast is that history is not just a story about the past, it's an explanation for our present. It reasonably follows from that if you misunderstand the past, you misunderstand the present. And if enough people misunderstand the present, that can have very real consequences for our society. As a young man exploring my love of history in the early days of the internet, I was taken in by some bad history. History that was politically motivated and designed to manipulate impressionable young people like me. It's only because I had very patient mentors like Professor Tom Rainey, who I hope is listening to this podcast, that I was able to examine the historiography, that is, the methods of how we study history, of flawed sources that were informing my understanding of the past. Rather than trying to indoctrinate me and tell me what to think, Tom and others in my life focused in a very non-judgmental way on teaching me how to think. Slowly, through reading lots of good history and embracing the story of the past as a nuanced academic discipline, I emerged from the fog of pseudo-history. In more recent years, examples of this kind of bad history have become even more prolific on the internet, as social media algorithms have created not just a space, but a monetary incentive for people to peddle pseudo-history that confirms the biases of people who are stuck in an algorithmic echo chamber. So one of my main goals in starting this podcast was to try, in a very small way, to combat the flood of bad history that is pervasive on the internet with just a little bit of good history, and to do it from a place of empathy and understanding rather than judgment. This goal has informed the periods of history that I have thus far chosen to cover in this podcast. My first 3 episodes on the Creole affair were inspired by my social media feed being inundated with so-called lost cause pseudo-history that downplays or even denies entirely the central role of slavery and racism in American history, especially as it relates to the causes of the Civil War. I didn't take on the subject of debunking the lost cause directly in that series, mostly because there are so many content creators who have already done a great job of doing so. One example is the Checkmate Lincolnite series by Atunche Films on YouTube. That's a lot of fun. But I chose to tell a different story that was perhaps less well known and also highlighted the centrality of slavery, not just in American history, but the history of the entire Western Hemisphere. As an aside, I'm immensely proud of the work I did on those 3 episodes, but they were also my very first attempt at podcasting, so I will just say that the podcast has come a long way since then. I had similar thoughts when I embarked on the present series. I was inspired by the avalanche of misinformation online about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly social media posts I saw framing the invasion as justified because Ukraine is allegedly part of historic Russia and therefore not a real country. Again, I saw so many good historians and content creators rush to debunk this myth, especially those that denied the historical existence of a Ukrainian national identity. But I also saw a major gap in the story. A lot of people were saying that the war had to do with the way things were left when the Soviet Union fell apart, but I saw few comprehensive explanations of how and why that happened. And there was my opening. All of this has been a very long-winded way of saying that the past informs the present. In my experience, history rarely repeats itself, but it often resembles itself. And we can and should draw conclusions from the past about analogous situations in the present. This podcast is not about present-day American politics, and I will never try to tell you what to believe or how to vote. But nor will I shy away from addressing controversial or difficult subjects that relate to the present, including when that is a discussion of present-day issues that relates to the history I'm talking about. In short, this podcast is apolitical, but that doesn't mean I will never bring up politics or express opinions. About 3 months prior to the recording of this episode, in June 2024, I tuned into a presidential debate, as I always do. I'm very tuned into politics and current events, and I've watched every presidential debate in the United States since 2000. What I witnessed that night was unlike anything I'd seen in any of those debates, or indeed anything I've witnessed in my lifetime observing politics. I watched in real time what I believe to be the unraveling of a presidential candidacy and a political career. Joe Biden, at the age of 81, appeared to be suffering from severe cognitive decline. He appeared confused, and his answers were rambling and often incoherent. Americans as a whole were already concerned that a man of his age might be on the decline and may not be fit to serve as president, and what a lot of us saw in that debate confirmed those fears. I know I've been cryptic in the past about my political beliefs, and I still don't want to make that a central theme of the podcast. Everyone is welcome in the history sphere. But lest some of you think that I'm being partisan here, it's actually the opposite. My personal beliefs lean more towards the Democratic Party, and I tuned into that debate hoping that Joe Biden would do well. It's just not what I saw from an objective standpoint. His performance in the debate set in motion a series of events that led to his replacement as the Democratic nominee for president by his vice president, Kamala Harris. And now, in the weeks since the debate and downfall of Joe Biden, Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, who is only 3 years his junior at 78, now that we no longer have Joe Biden to compare him to, appears to be showing signs of his age as well. Though his speeches have always been a little disjointed and at times incoherent in my opinion, they've recently become more so, and he also appears to have a lot less energy than he did 4 and 8 years ago. If he were to be elected president, Donald Trump would be the oldest man ever elected to that office, and were he to serve his full term, he would become the oldest man ever to serve as president. I know this introduction is longer than usual, so some of you may be wondering if I have a point that has anything to do with the Soviet Union coming up, and I promise I do. Here it is. Multiple historians and contemporaries who recall the period refer to the Soviet Union in the first half of the 1980s as a gerontocracy, that is, rule by the very old. It's commonly cited as one of the reasons for the decline of the Soviet Union, that the aging and infirm rulers of the USSR were both out of touch with a rapidly changing world and simply not cognitively fit to lead the country through that difficult time. This is, of course, not the sole or probably even the main reason for the decline of the USSR, but it is a contributing factor, a point that most of the experts I have read seem to agree on. But the more I read this point, the more it causes me to reflect on my own country. Joe Biden is 81, and Trump is 78. The current Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will turn 74 next month, and his predecessor and current Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is 82. By contrast, Leonid Brezhnev was 75 when he died in 1982. Yuri Andropov was only 69 when he died just 15 months later, and Konstantin Chernenko, who succeeded Andropov, was only 73 when he died just 13 months after that. The gerontocracy was started by Brezhnev, and I covered some of the reasons that it emerged back in episode 21 when I first talked about the Brezhnev era and economic stagnation. Brezhnev's predecessor, Nikita Khrushchev, had been fond of firing and replacing people in leadership positions across the Communist Party. He believed that regular turnover in these positions kept those in positions of power from abusing that power or corruptly using their position to garner too much personal wealth, while at the same time keeping the party and therefore the government on the cutting edge by constantly reinvigorating it with fresh ideas. And to a degree, Khrushchev was right. His tenure as general secretary was, in hindsight, pretty successful. The economy, though it lagged behind the West, was at least in a more or less steady state of growth. And under his leadership, the Soviet scientific establishment was on the cutting edge, dominating the early part of the space race and making numerous other contributions to the arts and sciences. But in his quest for what he called socialist democracy, in the constant changing of leadership in the party and state, excluding his own position, of course, Khrushchev forgot to whom he owed his position: the upper echelon of the Communist Party. In other words, the very people whose job security and livelihood these policies threatened. By 1964, the Party Central Committee and the Politburo had had enough. They removed Khrushchev from the position of General Secretary and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was keenly aware of the mistakes of his predecessor. He knew to whom he owed his position, and was careful not to offend the upper echelon of the party. So he safeguarded his position by going to the other extreme. Those in the leadership of the party and government had almost perfect job security, no matter how incompetent, corrupt, or old they got. The problems this led to are similar to the problems among ordinary workers who could not easily be fired that I addressed back in episode 21. In a socialist system where there was little hope of advancement due to good performance, and little hope of negative repercussions due to poor performance, there was generally a lack of much motivation to do more than go through the motions. Corruption and criminality were seen by many as the only way to get ahead. As a result, corruption became endemic across Soviet society. Brezhnev referred to his doctrine of never firing high-ranking party members as stability of the cadres, which was taken from an obscure Lenin quote about the necessity of stability and continuity in party institutions. As a result of this policy to maintain the stability of the cadres, it was not only the general secretary who grew older and more infirm, but most of his deputies as well. And speaking of old and infirm, especially after 1975, when he suffered the first of several strokes, Leonid Brezhnev became increasingly ineffective as his cognitive functions steadily declined. Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the few relatively young up-and-comers who managed to advance in the party apparatus during the late Brezhnev era, recalled a meeting with Brezhnev, his chief advisor Konstantin Chernenko, and KGB head Yuri Andropov on a train platform in 1978. He said that Brezhnev, quote, was not quite there and didn't notice us as we walked alongside him, end quote. As the meeting concluded, Gorbachev recalled that Brezhnev turned to Andropov and asked how his speech was. At the time, Gorbachev said he assumed that Andropov was helping the general secretary to prepare an oration, and only later did he realize that Brezhnev was referring to his own ability to speak, which he had increasing trouble with following multiple strokes. The state of Brezhnev's health was not public knowledge at the time, and was a closely kept secret by his inner circle, of which Gorbachev was not yet a part, though Andropov and Chernenko were certainly well aware. As the general secretary sank into senility, he increasingly became a figurehead as members of his inner circle took control of the Central Committee and maneuvered against one another to secure the succession. There were four main contenders to succeed Brezhnev: Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister who had been a fixture in the party since Stalin; Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, the career soldier whose presence in party circles also went back to Stalin, who had appointed him as the People's Commissar for Armaments in 1941. There was Second Party Secretary Konstantin Chernenko, Brezhnev's chief deputy and political advisor, and finally KGB head Yuri Andropov. Gromyko seems to have not really wanted the position, and Ustinov failed to garner enough support in the Central Committee to make a true run at it. In the end, it came down to Andropov and Chernenko. Chernenko enjoyed the support of the party bureaucracy, from whose ranks he had emerged, while Andropov enjoyed the support of the KGB and the intelligence establishment, from whose ranks he had emerged. After he failed to make a run at the position himself, Ustinov also threw his support behind Andropov, and with Ustinov's support came the Red Army leadership. Chernenko used his proximity to Brezhnev to garner support from fence-sitters, making it appear as though he was the natural successor to Brezhnev. However, this strategy suffered a major blow when in July 1982, when in one of his few remaining lucid moments, Brezhnev indicated that he wished Andropov to take over leadership of a meeting of the Central Committee in his absence. It's unclear whether he meant this to be permanent or not, but Gorbachev recalls in his memoirs that the air seemed to shift in Andropov's favor from that moment, because it appeared, to those who still had not chosen a side, that Brezhnev had anointed Andropov as his successor. When, just a few months later, on November 10, 1982, Leonid Brezhnev suffered a massive heart attack and died, the struggle for power was short. Yuri Andropov was elected General Secretary just 2 days later, on November 12th. Few biographies have been written about Yuri Andropov, and attempting to unlock the mystery of who this man was has been one of the most frustrating and difficult research tasks I have faced since I took on this project, surpassed only by my similar attempts to piece together the biography of his successor, Chernenko, which I will get to shortly. Yuri Andropov was born in 1914 in the Stavropol region of Russia's North Caucasus. His father, Vladimir Andropov, was a rail worker who passed away when Yuri was only 5. Andropov would later say that he had no memory of his father. The identity of his mother is shrouded in secrecy. His official autobiography makes no mention of her, nor do any of the contemporary biographical sources. The mystery is heightened by the fact that very little has been written about Yuri Andropov in English. I did find an article published in the Russian tabloid newspaper Sovershенно Sekret, or Top Secret, in 2008, which identifies Andropov's mother as Yevgenia Karlovna Fleckenstein, the daughter of a Jewish watchmaker from Finland who operated a shop in Moscow. The author of the article, Leonid Brezhnev, was generally considered to be a reputable journalist, and he claims that this information is derived from official archived documents from the Kremlin. But since I have not seen the actual documents he's referencing, I can't verify the accuracy of his information, so take it with a grain of salt. I do find his mother's potentially Jewish origin to be a plausible explanation for why her identity is scrubbed from the official sources. As I have discussed in earlier episodes, even though the revolution abolished official anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic attitudes remained pervasive throughout the society, including in the halls of power. Were it known that his mother was Jewish, Andropov may have been prevented from advancing as far as he did. As the head of the KGB for 15 years from 1967 to 1982, he certainly had the means to cover up his origins, if indeed he had the inclination to. In my research, I did not identify any potential alternative identities for his mother, so if it was not Yevgenia Fleckenstein, then I simply have no idea who his mother was. Yuri first joined the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, in 1930 at the age of 16. He quickly rose through the ranks of the Komsomol, and in 1940, on the eve of World War II, he was appointed as the first secretary of the Komsomol for the Karelo-Finnish Soviet Republic, the short-lived Soviet Republic that was abolished and reincorporated into the Russian Republic in 1956. According to his official biography, he was engaged in guerrilla warfare in Finland during the Second World War, but none of his more objective biographers have been able to find any evidence of these activities, or that his squad that he supposedly led even existed. As with his predecessor Brezhnev and other prominent Soviet leaders, it seems that Andropov's war record was likely embellished in order to enhance his legitimacy. Whatever his actual role during and after the war was, we know that he became a full member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1944, and he quickly rose through the ranks, earning appointment to the party's Central Committee in 1951, and in 1954 he became Soviet ambassador to Hungary, where he played a key role in suppressing the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. This experience had a pretty dramatic impact on Andropov's worldview. While in public, he helped to formulate and propagate the official Soviet line that the uprising in Hungary had been led by a minority of counter-revolutionaries spurred on by Western intelligence services. He knew the truth. He understood that the uprising in Budapest had been a popular revolution, supported by the majority of the population, including students and workers, who should have made up the backbone of support for the Communist Party. It made him very wary of any kind of popular democracy or change from below. Contrary to one common misconception about him, Yuri Andropov was not a champion of the status quo. He understood that the stagnation of the Brezhnev era was unsustainable, and that changes, even dramatic changes, had to be made if the Soviet Union was to survive. But he was an adamant authoritarian as well. He believed that those changes had to come from the top, from the party, not from any misguided notions of democracy. Because he did understand the need for reform and believed it had to come from the party, he was all about reforming and revitalizing the party. He made a habit of identifying talented young party members and, as he rose in the party, he took them with him. One such talented young party member selected by Andropov for preferment was Mikhail Gorbachev. And as it would turn out, that is the one thing he's generally remembered for, because without Andropov, you don't get Gorbachev. From 1967 to 1982, most of the Brezhnev era, Andropov was in charge of the KGB. As I discussed briefly in episode 23, he spent a great deal of time in this role, attempting to infiltrate, discredit, and stifle various dissident groups in the Soviet Union. While the KGB of the Brezhnev era was not the sheer terror machine the NKVD of Stalin had been, Andropov's hardline authoritarian views meant he had little tolerance for dissent, and he certainly had plenty of blood on his hands. In May 1982, less than 6 months before his death, Brezhnev recalled Andropov from his leadership of the KGB and appointed him as second secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee, the chief administrative deputy to the general secretary. This was the move that, whether intentional or not, signaled to the party leadership that Andropov, not Chernenko, was Brezhnev's chosen successor. On November 7, 1982, Brezhnev made his last public appearance, presiding over the military parade on Red Square in Moscow to commemorate the 65th anniversary of the October Revolution. He appeared frail and sickly, flanked on either side and seeming almost to be physically propped up by Chernenko and Andropov. 3 days later, on November 10th, he suffered a fatal heart attack and died. He was 75 years old, and he had presided over the party and the Soviet state for just over 18 years. An entire generation had been born and come of age knowing no other leader. When 3 days later, Yuri Andropov was elected to replace him as general secretary, your average Soviet citizen probably didn't really know what to expect. As I covered before, Andropov was, likely by his own intention, a somewhat mysterious figure. Upon assuming the office of General Secretary in 1982, Andropov was already suffering from a number of serious health ailments, including the chronic kidney disease that would claim his life. But his health problems were a closely guarded secret, even within the inner circle of the party. Even those close to him, like Mikhail Gorbachev, were unaware of the extent and seriousness of his health problems. Despite the serious health issues that were destroying his body, his mind remained sharp, and he dove into the job headfirst with a level of energy that is, in hindsight, surprising for a man as ill as he was. He had sought to become general secretary not because he wanted the prestige or simply to coast on the downward spiral of Brezhnev's stagnation. He could see that the system was failing, and he intended to fix it. And he was the sort of man who might have done it if his body didn't quit on him first. Of all the Soviet leaders, in my opinion, he was probably the most intelligent and self-aware, though in fact he had the least formal education out of any of them. He was nonetheless highly self-educated. He was constantly reading books about various subjects from history and law to science and engineering. One of his economic advisors, Oleg Bogomolov, recalled seeing books by Montaigne and Machiavelli on Andropov's desk. When he asked why Andropov was reading them, Andropov said to him, quote, "so as to be able to speak with you and your colleagues as equals," end quote. Though his governing philosophy was firmly authoritarian, he did not rule as a dictator. He liked to surround himself with capable advisors, and he listened to their advice. He once told his team of advisors, quote, "In this room, we talk openly and frankly. No one should conceal his real views. It's another matter when you go through that door. Outside, of course, you conduct yourselves according to generally accepted rules." End quote. Andropov was determined to fix the problems that ailed Soviet society, but unfortunately, in my opinion, he misunderstood what those problems were. He saw the endemic corruption and inefficiency that plagued every facet of the economy, but like the other Soviet leaders, he was blinded by his commitment to communist ideology. He simply could not conceive that the root of the problem was the planned socialist economy itself, that it was a problem in the concept, not in the execution. You may recall from episode 21 that it had become common among ordinary workers who were underpaid, had little chance of promotion, and an equally small chance of being fired, to take time during the workday to run errands and do other things during the day when they were supposed to be at work. Moonlighting was also common, as workers were unable to make a sufficient living in their official jobs, and so those with special skills like mechanics and plumbers plied their trade on the black market to people who didn't want to wait to receive those services from state institutions. And finally, pilfering was a common practice among many Soviet workers. For example, grocery store workers would take small amounts of food from the store where they worked and trade them for other things that they needed. All of this together was euphemistically known as the second economy. If you want a more detailed explanation of this topic, I covered it back in episode 21 in slightly more detail. Andropov looked at these activities in the second economy and concluded that they were the cause of the sluggish economy rather than symptoms of it. His solution was to crack down hard on these behaviors. Police and KGB agents were sent out during the day to confront people who were supposed to be at work and issue criminal citations to those who were absent from their job without an excuse. Pilferers and moonlighters were similarly cracked down on, and several public trials were held and harsh sentences handed down to make an example and deter the wider public from engaging in these activities. The crackdown did little to stop people from pilfering or moonlighting, as many of the people doing these things were doing them out of necessity rather than greed. To the extent that it made a difference at all, these measures probably actually made things worse. As I mentioned in episode 21, the second economy was a significant portion of the nation's total GDP, and the crackdown only shrunk this vital, though illegal, sector of the economy. Andropov, for all his faults, however, was a fair man. He didn't limit his crackdown to going after the little guy. During the Brezhnev era, a certain level of corruption by powerful party officials was tolerated, and while they looked the other way, the state and party officially denied the existence of corruption anywhere in the country. With Andropov in charge, this blind eye was turned no more. For the first time in a generation, the large-scale corruption of high-ranking Communist Party members was exposed. The culprits were fired, and in many cases, prosecuted. One particularly noteworthy episode in this crackdown on large-scale corruption was the Uzbek cotton scandal. Sharof Rashidov, the first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party, had for years been artificially inflating his official reports on levels of cotton production in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is largely a desert country. While the heat of the desert climate there is conducive to growing cotton, most of the country lacks the annual rainfall or water resources to effectively grow the crop. Because of the economic demand for cotton in the global market, Soviet planners as early as the 1920s began manipulating the rivers and lakes of Uzbekistan to irrigate the cotton crop, turning the country into a cotton-producing powerhouse, but wreaking havoc on its ecology. For example, the Aral Sea, once one of the largest lakes in the world, was reduced to an empty desert, with old rusted ships on the dry desert floor and a few sporadic lakes that were once its deepest parts, the only remaining evidence of its existence. Every successive 5-year plan demanded more and more cotton from the strained resources of Uzbekistan, until finally it reached its capacity, even with all the environmental devastation. And so, Rashidov and his cronies had just a foolproof idea that was just really, really great. They decided to just say they were meeting or even exceeding production quotas on paper, while of course falling far short in reality. They accepted payment from the state for the reported amount of cotton and simply pocketed the difference between the reported amount and the much smaller amount of cotton that was actually produced. Rashidov lived in an opulent mansion, as did many of his close associates and family members benefiting from the scheme, who Andropov came to call the Cotton Mafia. As head of the KGB in the 60s and 70s, Andropov was aware of the activities of this Cotton Mafia, but the Brezhnev-era policy of refusing to even acknowledge the existence of corruption among high-ranking party members meant there was little he could do to stop it. When he became general secretary, in addition to his campaigns against ordinary workers, Andropov went after the big fish too, including the Cotton Mafia. Under his direction, the KGB exposed the scheme, and prosecutors began cracking down and arresting members of the Cotton Mafia. Rashidov would die in October 1983, while under investigation for his role in the cotton scandal. His official cause of death was a fatal heart attack, but some have speculated that he committed suicide to avoid the consequences of a trial. I haven't seen sufficient evidence of this suicide theory to substantiate it, but it probably can't be ruled out either. The Uzbek cotton scandal is just one of many examples of authorities cracking down on corruption within the party establishment. Though many resented the crackdown on ordinary workers, the concurrent crackdown on large-scale corruption did serve to increase ordinary people's confidence in the justice system and the integrity of the Communist Party. It's hard to know what might have happened if Andropov had taken the reins earlier or if he had had more time to complete his reforms. In time, he may have listened to advice from his advisors who advocated bolder economic reform, like the Georgian Communist Party leader Eduard Shevardnadze or the aforementioned Gorbachev. But we can only speculate. Within a few months of taking power, his health began to rapidly decline. In February 1983, his kidneys ceased to function on their own, and he began regular dialysis treatments. His kidney problems were exacerbated by diabetes and high blood pressure. As his health declined, public appearances and participation in meetings of the Politburo became increasingly infrequent, as he relied on his advisors and the perpetual mechanisms of the party bureaucracy to rule in his stead. He attended his last Politburo meeting on September 1, 1983, and was thereafter too sick to attend meetings in person. He nonetheless read through notes of every meeting and continued to issue orders and directives to his subordinates from his hospital bed. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was probably the closest thing Andropov had to a true friend, remembered this period with significant emotion, recalling of one visit with Andropov in the hospital in December 1983. Quote, "He was a totally different person. His eyes were dim, he barely looked up. I exerted every effort to look away, to somehow disguise my shock." End quote. Yuri Andropov died on February 9, 1984. He was 69 years old and had presided over the party and Soviet state for just under 15 months. On his deathbed, he attempted to name Mikhail Gorbachev as his successor, asking that he be charged with chairmanship in his absence. Konstantin Chernenko and his supporters, however, had taken advantage of Andropov's absence to seize the reins of the Politburo meetings, and they ensured that the Politburo and the Central Committee never heard about Andropov's request. And thus, on February 13, 1984, Konstantin Chernenko, not Mikhail Gorbachev, was elected as the new General Secretary of the Communist Party. Chernenko was even older and unhealthier than Andropov had been upon assuming power. Born to ethnically Ukrainian parents in the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia in 1911, Chernenko had followed a similar path to power as other Soviet leaders. He first joined the Komsomol, then became a full party member in 1930. He served in the Red Army as a border guard on the Chinese-Soviet border from 1930 to 1933. He went on to become a Communist Party apparatchik, specializing in propaganda. His big break came in 1948, when he was assigned to a post as the head of the propaganda department in Moldova, where he met and impressed Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev recognized Chernenko's talent for administration and singled him out for promotion. Thereafter, wherever Brezhnev went, Chernenko followed, being promoted along with his patron. When Brezhnev became General Secretary in 1964, he made Chernenko his chief administrator, tasking him with setting the agenda for meetings of the Politburo and drafting decrees from the Central Committee. He became a full member of the Central Committee in 1971 and was promoted to the Politburo in 1978. Thwarted in his attempt to become General Secretary on Brezhnev's death in 1982, his moment finally came in February 1984, when he successfully sidelined Gorbachev and became General Secretary. By this time, however, he was no longer the formidable and competent administrator he had once been. Even Ilya Zemtsov, who is probably his most sympathetic biographer, acknowledged that by the time he took over the reins of power, he was much diminished. In July 1984, an interpreter with the British Foreign Service, Tony Bishop, noted that Chernenko exhibited shortness of breath, had to pause the meeting for a long coughing fit, seemed bewildered and confused, and had great difficulty even reading prepared statements. American historian John Lewis Gaddis described Chernenko as, quote, an enfeebled geriatric, so zombie-like as to be beyond assessing intelligence reports, end quote. Indeed, even before he became General Secretary, Chernenko was suffering from chronic emphysema and heart disease. Like his predecessor, he was frequently absent from meetings of the Politburo due to illness and hospitalization, but unlike his predecessor, he paid little attention to the affairs of state during his hospitalizations, instead leaving the business of state completely to the perpetual bureaucracy. This did open up an opportunity for Gorbachev to take a more active role in leadership. Much as Chernenko had done during Andropov's absence, Gorbachev now stepped up to lead Politburo meetings in his stead, becoming, for all intents and purposes, the de facto General Secretary. On March 10, 1985, Chernenko slipped into a coma and died. An autopsy stated that his cause of death was a combination of emphysema, heart failure, and cirrhosis of the liver. He was 73 years old and had ruled the Soviet Union, applying the loosest definition of that term possible, for just over a year. The death of Konstantin Chernenko cleared the way for the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the final General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And that is where I will pick up next time. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to give a very special thank you to my patrons and supporters. If you're not supporting the show yet, but you want to, you can support me with a monthly donation on Spotify or Patreon. Links to both can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. Also on the website, you will find links to all of this podcast's streaming platforms and a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Again, as always, if you can't afford to support the show right now financially, you can still support me by subscribing and liking or giving the show a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. And if you have friends or family who love history, you can help out the show by telling them about us too. When I return in 2 weeks, I will take a closer look at the life and career of Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who was destined to preside over the final dissolution of the USSR. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.